What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about the recent announcement of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. I consider myself to be in the small cadre of, I guess not Space Marine YouTubers, because I don't really make Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine content, but I am a YouTuber who owns a copy of Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, which I think puts me in a pretty niche club. If you're not familiar with my content, I actually play Warhammer 40k Space Marine, the original Space Marine from back in 2011, pretty often, mostly for B-roll on videos. I'm basically a drama tuber from 2010. But today, 10 years after the release of the original Space Marine, we got the announcement at the VGA award show of Space Marine 2. And we're going to talk about it, break down the trailer, and talk about some of the important facts to know about this new release. It's super exciting for me as a Warhammer 40k fan. In my opinion, Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, the original, was one of the best, most quintessential Warhammer 40k games that doesn't have Dawn of War in its title. It really did its best to immerse you into the universe and into your role as a Space Marine. You felt like your character had impact. You felt like you were this big, heavy, hulking war machine and were able to just cleave through dozens of opponents, which you typically did in that game. The game was relatively short and cut some corners. It definitely wasn't a perfect experience, but I think it stands the test of time as one of the best pieces of Warhammer 40k multimedia out there, and I hope that this new one can live up to the legacy. This installment in the series has actually been moved entirely away from Relic Entertainment, which is unfortunate. Relic was a company that I have a pretty positive connection with. Games like Homeworld 2 were a big part of my childhood, and obviously, not to mention Warhammer 40k Space Marine, which I played for hours when I was a kid. So seeing that Relic Entertainment old Sea Mine cinematic at the start of all of their games kind of gives me a feeling of nostalgia. This one has been moved to Focus Entertainment, which is a relatively unknown French video game publisher, and it's being created by Saber Interactive, an interesting choice for a game like this. Saber Interactive with such hits on their portfolio as Bass Pro Shops The Strike Championship Edition, the classic, other absolute blockbusters such as R.I.P.D. The Game, a game probably played by as many people as who saw R.I.P.D. when it released in theaters. That's absolutely nobody. Most of Saber Interactive's portfolio is built out of ports or updates to existing games, things like Anniversary Edition and remasters. They did a lot of work on the Halo franchise, which, as you probably know, is another franchise that's close to my heart. But I've also done some work on franchises like Killing Floor, which is very similar in concept and execution to the original Space Marine, mostly being a zombie horde survival game, which is very similar to the original Space Marine. But now we have a new one that's just been announced. So let's break down the trailer and talk about exactly what we can expect from this new and exciting release. Ah, a classic establishing shot. Looking good. It's a classic sting from the original game as well. Those 3 notes were the menu music of the original game. Ah, the nostalgia is real. One thing I do like about this sequence in particular, the las guns that the Imperial Guardsmen are carrying actually have some impact behind their sound effects. One thing that a lot of games like to do, because las guns, especially in the tabletop game, are sort of a meme, is make them sound very piddly, very, kind of classic sci-fi laser weapon where they're just going pew, 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 pew. But these ones have a little bit of a snap to them, which I really like. It is a weapon that essentially vaporizes most of a human on contact, but the universe of Warhammer 40,000 is so incredibly over the top that a weapon that kills almost any human being almost instantly is small potatoes compared to some of the big artillery that the main characters are carrying. Company command. First platoon. Now, one thing we see in the background here is actually a Tyrannocyte. These are essentially orbital drop organisms that the Tyranids use. Normally, they float around after they have dispensed their cargo, They're dropped from a hive ship in orbit, and they sort of float down like a balloon, I guess, and then expel all of their contents out of the ground. I think this one's dead, which is why it's on the ground, but normally they don't impact the ground, at least in the tabletop game. In the tabletop game, they float around after they make impact, and they shoot people. They have some guns on them and stuff. But this one, it looks like it ate a cargo container, actually, which is kind of interesting. That might have been what killed it. I've heard that those things are not very good for your health.
First platoon, we've lost the square. We can't hold it.
So this guy is actually a Tyranid Prime, at least based on the sort of aesthetic of the character. That's because of these big flanges out here. The Tyranid Primes have this big sort of armored collar to differentiate them from the regular Tyranid warriors. The Tyranid warriors are the ones that boss around the little organisms, and the Tyranid Primes are the ones that boss around the Tyranid warriors. Now, I think, just based on sort of the design language of the game so far, I think that they're just using the exaggerated features of the Tyranid Prime as just a regular Tyranid warrior, that we see multiple of them in some gameplay later. So I imagine that this actually, in the canon of the game, is just a regular Tyranid warrior, but the actual collar makes it a Tyranid Prime. Not a really big deal, though. That ground punching impact. I absolutely love it. Now, interestingly here, too, the Ultramarine squad is actually kitted out all differently. Titus here, the main character guy, he's got his heavy bolt pistol, he's got his chainsword, he's ready to go assault intercessoring all over the place. But the other two intercessors with him have a standard bolt rifle with that curved magazine, which I think typically has a higher muzzle velocity than the other weapons, whereas the other guy here has this drum magazine, which denotes him as carrying an auto bolt rifle, which has a higher rate of fire. Those are differences in the tabletop game. This one shoots 3 times, and this one only shoots 2 times, but this one penetrates armor better. It's interesting to see these translated over to a video game medium, because the fact that the weapons are so close in design means that they would be difficult to differentiate inside gameplay. So I'd be surprised if they were like dramatically distinct weapons, but it is nice to see all of them represented in this shot. Just morale check immediately failed there. The Zormagons want nothing to do with these guys. Now, I actually really like this shot because I think it's a good sort of a little bit of a visual indicator of the Tyranid Synapse web. The way Tyranids work is they're actually a hive mind, so the little guys here, basically just cannon fodder. These are Hormagaunts. They have swords for arms, and so that should basically tell you all you need to know about their life cycle. They have essentially the intelligence of your standard gerbil, but the bigger Tyranid organisms, like the Tyranid warriors and the Tyranid primes, can command them essentially by linking them to the collective consciousness of all of the Tyranid creatures, most notably the smarter ones. This is called the Synapse web. It's like a psychic link that links all of the Tyranids together, but essentially, without proximity to these more powerful creatures, the little guys don't really know what to do. So in this scene, they basically weren't sure how to react to new stimuli until they got feedback back from the Gestalt being relayed through this Tyranid Prime, telling them to probably go stab those bad men. It didn't work out for them, though. They all died. That's a pretty accurate representation of how effective Hormagaunts are in the tabletop game as well. Ah, right in half. Gross. I love these close-ups. The aesthetic that they've done with it, the Tyranid carapace here, is very cool. This kind of striated, very stony almost appearance. Just looks fucking awesome. We can also see that their skin is kind of scaled as well, if you look closely, which I think is interesting. It's always been kind of a weirdness with Tyranids, given that they have just these multiple organic textures on their bodies, and it's always been interesting how different artists depict the texture of those different materials that they're composed of. We can clearly see that these here are essentially tendons or muscle fibers is what they look like, whereas we have the scaly appearance of their skin versus the very hard, stony carapace. Ah, Oh, just looks phenomenal. I'm a big Tyranid fan, if you didn't know that. I play mostly Tyranids in the tabletop game, and that's what a lot of the content on this channel is about. So it's seeing Tyranids rendered in this detail is very cool. Now, it's interesting here is that in order for Titus to win this fight, we have to make sure that the Tyranid Prime doesn't use his rending claws. He just leaves them there. This is a big benefit Tyranids have in close combat, as they have 4 arms. But even in the tabletop game, they actually typically only use one of their melee weapons, even if they're equipped with multiple of them. So this is an accurate representation of how this fight would go down in the tabletop. Interestingly, these are bone swords, the weapons that he's carrying in his other appendages. And typically, they're actually linked up to the Tyranid warrior itself. We can see that they have this little kind of pocket on their forearm here, and that oftentimes feeds kind of an umbilical tube to whatever weapon they're carrying, so that the weapon can get nutrients and get fed commands by the carrying organism. Their weapons are also actually separate organisms that are grown separately and then sort of grafted onto each of the Tyranids. The bone swords themselves are, I think, essentially supposed to be like a biological crystalline structure that's sort of unnaturally hardy and essentially can cut through, almost functionally anything. Boom! The under the belt shot there. Low blow, Titus. And it just rips his head clean off. Now, obviously, Titus has been upgraded here to be a Primaris Space Marine. So he's even bigger and stronger than a standard Space Marine, which is why he's sort of very casually able to complete feats of superhuman strength, like ripping a Tyranid warrior's head off. These things are like 3 meters tall or something. Just the size of these Tyranid organisms is enormous. And so being able to just pull their head off like that would require an immense amount of effort, which obviously you can do if you're a Primaris Space Marine. I'm as shocked as that guy is. We can see a better shot here of the Tyrannocyte in the background. It's going to be interesting to see whether these make an appearance in gameplay. In the original game, orcs used to deploy in waves or throughout the campaign from rocks, which are just asteroids that orcs had hollowed out and filled with orcs and then sent to a planet. And Tyrannocytes essentially fulfill the same function, but just for Tyranids. So I have a sneaking suspicion that we'll see them drop onto the ground and then disgorge contents when you're playing in a wave mode or something like that. Now, the Space Marines obviously are sort of meant to be a divine representation of the God Emperor who rules over the Imperium, or is I guess, sort of the ceremonial figurehead of the Imperium. He doesn't do a lot of ruling these days. But Space Marines are supposed to be sort of his will made physically manifest. So all of the normal citizenry of the Imperium has to show them the utmost respect. Now, what's interesting here is that in the previous game, Titus was a captain, and in this, it very much looks like he's wearing the regalia of a lieutenant. Now, I'm not an expert on the Space Marine rank insigniae, but if we look at a Primaris lieutenant model, it is essentially all of the same armor indicators that Titus is wearing here. So it'd be interesting to see if he actually received a demotion from the previous game. The end of the previous game had him being escorted off by the Inquisition, so I wonder if maybe there was maybe some consequences to his brush with chaos at the end of that last game, and now he's a lowly lieutenant. In order to distinguish him out as a captain in the previous game, his armor was actually very ornate. He had a lot of gold filigree and a lot of gold trimming on it to differentiate it from him from the rest of the squad. But in this case, the intercessor armor he's wearing is not very bedecked at all. That is fairly consistent with Primaris Space Marines in general, though, because the Primaris line of Space Marines and all their equipment is newer than the original Firstborn Space Marines, who are wearing armor that's in some cases like 10,000 years old and has been upgraded and modified by every user throughout those 10,000 years, which is why it's like so different looking and so unique and so ornate looking. The Primaris armor was mostly just like churned out of a factory a couple hundred years ago. So it's significantly less modified than the original, which is why we don't see quite as much, interesting detailing that we saw on his armor previously. So I don't know whether or not that does mean that he is a lieutenant versus a captain. He may still be a captain, but I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. This guy's helmet makes him look like Small Face. And we do see a lot of detail here in this hive city that's being attacked, basically this huge ecumenopolis that most humans live in the 41st millennium. These little guys here, I believe that these are gargoyles, which is basically another variety of gaunt like the Hormagaunts. It just flies and they carry a gun. And I believe that these are probably these falling, meteorites here are probably going to end up being Tyrannocytes that are falling to Earth and are going to disgorge Tyranids on the ground. Even before they attack a planet, Tyranids tend to create all sorts of kind of tectonic disturbances on the planet that they're going into. So even before too many Tyranids have made planetfall, a lot of times you'll see these cities like in ruins before they even get there. It makes a good setting for an action game since ruined cities create a lot of interesting terrain to play around, but it's nice that it has a canonical backstory as well. Now, clearly, crossing the Rubicon Primaris has not been easy for Captain or maybe Lieutenant Titus here. He looks totally different than the original game. And I think a lot of that is just the advancement in graphical technology in the last 10 years so that he can be rendered in more detail. But oh boy, does he not look like he's aged well. I actually did not even know it was the same character. Although you can kind of hand wave that away by saying that the upgrade from a Firstborn Space Marine to a Primaris Space Marine is going to be hell on your body, and you're going to look way different at the end. Your bone structure changes and your musculature changes, and you're not going to look like the same person. Now, interestingly, we do see that he has 4 service studs on his forehead here. The previous Titus had 2. I believe, and this might be wrong, I believe that gold studs indicate 100 years of service. So Titus in the previous game having 2 gold studs means that he had been serving for 200 years. Now we're at 400 years, which probably means that we're approximately 200 years progressed from the point of that last game, which I believe is consistent with the timeline of 40k. I believe that we have progressed 200 years from the launch of the Indominus Crusade. And then the title card. Looking good. Now, we do have some gameplay footage here. Now, this is obviously a Primaris jump pack, which is not something that exists in the tabletop game currently. The only jump pack Primaris units are wearing Gravis armor, which is the much heavier version of the Intercessor armor that we see the Space Marines wearing in the trailer. I guess, actually, the only instance of this type of technology that we see is actually Caven Shrike wears one of them in the tabletop game. But we do have him wearing grav boots, it looks like. Yeah, it looks like he is wearing grav boots, which is essentially there's a pad on the end of his boots here that is supposed to generate a repulsor field that kind of slows your fall because the Intercessor armor is so heavy that they would have a tough time landing without breaking stuff. He also has jets on his greaves there as well, which I think were used for maneuvering on the Gravis armored characters. But again, the really only place we see this in the tabletop game is on Caven Shrike. But it would be interesting to see more Primaris jump pack stuff in the future. Now, the original Space Marine was there was a lot of gameplay based around the Space Marine jump pack and using that. And it would be a travesty if we didn't see that return in this new game. So, I mean, they had to put some sort of jump pack in the game, I think, in order to live up to the legacy of the original. Now, here's where we see actually multiple Tyranid warriors, and they all look like the warrior from the opening cinematic. So they are all looks like Tyranid primes, but again, it may just be that this is the model that they've chosen to represent a regular Tyranid warrior who show up in relatively high numbers in high fleet attacks, whereas Tyranid primes you would see a lot less often. That may mostly be a gameplay consideration, so that they can use this kind of unique silhouette to differentiate them from, I guess, this sort of just mass of claws and tentacles that a Tyranid wave attacking you is going to look like. It very much looks like Hormagaunts are going to be the new orc boys from the previous game, where you would just fight hordes and hordes of identical orc boys. Didn't really work so well for orcs. I imagine that they all looked identical so that you could differentiate all of the different types of orcs on their war gear, but it was also probably the studio being lazy and strapped for time. It makes a lot more sense in Tyranids, though, that they're going to turn out, infinite identical clones of each other, because that's how Tyranids work. We see, interestingly, there's a Chimera transport up here. That's an APC for the Imperial Guardsmen. We also see a Basilisk Earthshaker carriage. It's a piece of artillery, basically a big howitzer. And then here again, we see a bunch of these little flying guys, I imagine, which are gargoyles. You can't really see it in the trailer right here because it's going to be super far away, but yeah, definitely a bunch of gargoyles. We also, interestingly, see this little insignia that Titus is carrying, which is an inquisitorial seal. It was rumored that Titus, between the two games, would have served time in the Death Watch, which is a kind of an inquisitorial strike force of Marines that's specifically keyed towards killing Xenos. I kind of anticipated that if Space Marine were ever to get a sequel, it would be focused on the Death Watch, but I imagine that with the IP as a whole's bigger focus on presenting Primaris Space Marines in all of their glory, and making them kind of the face of the IP, then it makes a lot more sense to do kind of an upgraded Primaris-sized Titus instead of a Death Watch Titus, which is, has significantly less audience resonance and takes a lot more time to explain to people. But if this is an indicator that he did serve with the Inquisition, or that he does maybe have some powers of the Inquisition, I think that'd be interesting. Boom. And there it is, the Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 trailer. I am so hyped for this game. I'm definitely going to be playing it here. I'm probably going to be streaming it as well when it releases. And as we get more information about the game, I will be keeping people posted because I'm super hyped for this game. I know a lot of people over in the Tactical Tortoise community over on Discord are super hyped as well. And I'm sure that we're going to get some community events going when it releases. It's going to be freaking awesome. Anyway, let me know down in the comments how hype you are. If you want to hear more about Warhammer 40k Space Marine or Warhammer 40k, the tabletop game as well, I talk about that all the time on the channel, so go ahead and drop a like, drop a subscribe down below. Big thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise in all of the different ways that you can. YouTube channel members, Patreon members, Twitch subscribers, all those people are phenomenal, and I absolutely love you. And I love you for watching to the end of the video. So remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.